angels we have heard on high, sweetly singing o'er the plains. And the
We're talking about immigration with Charisma Troiano. Again, just to reiterate, everyone here is an immigrant, right? That's why we're going to talk about the Indigenous Peoples March coming up. Also, we're streaming on Twitter and YouTube only, as we have logged out of Facebook at the request of the NAACP and logged out of Instagram, which Facebook owns, because of their practices towards the African American community. They allowed Russia to attack, infiltrate, and propagandize within the African American community. And Facebook did opposition research and waged attack against the black organization Color of Change. So there are consequences of that. The NAACP is asking us to log off today, December 18th. At least the NAACP is logged off for a whole week. Can you do that? Or are you existed? Are you addicted, rather, I should say. 866-99 series. Joining us now to talk about the Indigenous Peoples March coming up next month is our guest, Roberto Múkaro Borrero. Roberto, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, you are.
How are you, my brother?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, man, and welcome to the show. Tell us about your role and your involvement with the upcoming Indigenous Peoples March.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm really excited about the march. I think any time that we can bring Indigenous peoples together and lift up our voices in unity is a powerful statement of who we are and who we continue to be today. So I've been assisting as much as I can with this grassroots effort that's really been spearheaded by young women and young people who are really interested in the future of their communities, and not only their communities, but how life for their communities intersects with other communities and what's happening here in the United States and throughout the hemisphere and even beyond. So I'm fortunate to be affiliated with a few organizations and tribal entities like the United Confederation of Taino People, myself coming from Taino indigenous ancestry, from the Caribbean, also currently working with the U.S. Human Rights Network as their international mechanisms director, and the U.S. Human Rights Network is also endorsing the march. And so any way that I can help to promote or speak out and encourage people to be a part of it, physically being there on the day, if not spreading news about the march, through the various social media channels, by word of mouth, etc. Anyway, this is how I'm contributing.
Tell us more about your work with the U.S. Human Rights Network. You say international mechanisms, you said?
Correct. So what the U.S. Human Rights Network is a national organization. It's working to bring together different human rights organizations, and it could be anyone, any community or any grouping coming together to bring forth their issues in a human rights framework. Often in the U.S., most people talk about civil rights. But when we talk about human rights, we amplify the conversation. So what the organization does is help to amplify those voices, strengthen campaigns by broadening them using the human rights framework. In other words, that we're not only talking about civil rights when we talk about issues that affect our communities. We're talking about civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. So this is all within the human rights umbrella. And at the local level or at the national level, we often find that we can bring our issues out to a certain extent, but sometimes we don't get the restitution or we don't get the justice that we deserve. And so we need to take it even farther beyond that to add pressure and increase the visibility of the issues, right? And so what we mean by international mechanisms is that we engage international systems like the United Nations or the Organization of American States, anywhere where we can help amplify these voices. So U.S. Human Rights Network tries to bring folks together in this regard, learn about these issues, talk about how we can strengthen these campaigns, how we can raise the visibility, and also how folks on the local ground and grassroots level can bring their issues to an international forum. And this also again helps to add pressure, helps them better articulate campaigns in using the human rights framework. And so this is what we do. We're really trying to strengthen the human rights movement here in the U.S., and I think now we need this more than ever.
Well, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Now, you mentioned that you are Taino, Roberto.
Yes, yes,
Folks,
correct.
again, our guest, Roberto Múkaro Borrero of U.S. Human Rights Network, also with the Indigenous Peoples Movement at Indigenous PPLS on Twitter, okay? And you can follow them there. The march coming up on January 18th. I'll be there myself. We encourage others to be there as well. For those who don't know, tell people about the Taino people, if you would, Roberto.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Taino were actually the very first indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere to be called Indians. We had the infamous distinction of being the first communities. Our ancestors were the first communities that Columbus and other people coming over from what would become Europe met, right? And as you know, Columbus thought he was en route to the Indies and to India, and so he called our folks Indians. And we inhabit, our traditional territory extends from throughout the Greater Antilles. So you have islands like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, even into the southern tip of Florida. We're all part of our traditional territories. And, of course, into the smaller islands, we there was mixed territories with Taino people and Kalinago or other Carib-speaking, mixed Arawakan-speaking peoples. So these are like the main language groups from the area, the Arawakan languages, the Caribbean languages. And so that's who our people are traditionally and historically. We have a very interesting role in the history and the development of what we now know as America, the Americas.
And so, again, people need to appreciate the struggle of the indigenous people and the ongoing exploitation. We a lot of people think about the struggle of indigenous people in the past tense, Roberto.
Right, of
But
course.
indigenous people today, in many respects, are still being exploited, aren't they?
Oh, of course. I mean, when we talk about human rights, it was only until the year 2007 that, some indigenous peoples are saying that we were actually recognized as humans finally in the world's eyes, because that's when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the UN. And interestingly enough, 4 countries came out against that declaration, and if you can imagine who they are, I'll go right to them. The U.S., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all came out against that declaration. Why? Because it really articulated what are human rights in the context of indigenous peoples. For example, self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, meaning that if you plan as a government to do something in a territory of indigenous peoples, you have to consult with and get the consent of the indigenous peoples who are going to be affected. And we see, particularly with this administration, and of course others, it's not limited to this administration, but that kind of consultation and consent is continuously violated. Many indigenous peoples here over in the United States maintain treaties with the United States, and if you look at the Constitution, you know that treaties represent the supreme law of the land. But those treaties are continuously violated, and we saw what happened at Standing Rock as an example of that, and even more recently, what's going on with the monuments like Bears Ears Monument and other sacred lands of indigenous peoples that are now being opened up to extractive industries. There's ongoing exploitation. There's ongoing human rights. It's not all the indigenous peoples or the American Indians here in the U.S. We were given. They have their reservations and they're all okay because they could open up a casino. No, that's not the case. There's still high unemployment and many reservations. Not everyone has a casino or has gone that route for their economic development. So, I think there's a lot of education still needs to be happening here in the U.S. with regards to indigenous peoples. And the other thing is when we talk about indigenous peoples, especially for this march, I'm coming from indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, but when we talk about indigenous peoples of the Americas, we're talking about peoples who were here before the arrival of Europeans, from the top of Alaska all the way down to the tip of South America. These are indigenous peoples of the Americas, right? American Indians with different cultures and languages and ways of interacting with the world around them and with others. So this particular march, is really about bringing people together, bringing indigenous peoples together in an even stronger way than has been in the past. So, I'm very excited about it. I'm looking forward to meeting some of the other tribal leaders who are coming in, to hearing the voices of the youth. Of course, this is happening the day before the Women's March, so that'll be great as a kind of precursor to that march and to link the struggles, because, again, human rights are about everybody, right? And we could see that, whether it's indigenous peoples being affected, women, people of color, persons with disabilities, etc., we need to stand together at this time because there's a real erosion or attempt to erode our rights at the national level, but also at the international level. If you see what this current administration is doing, not attending human rights meetings, they pulled out of the Human Rights Council, they're not fulfilling their obligations to the 3 human rights treaties that they're a part of, they're not reporting when they should be reporting. So there's a real assault on this idea of human rights, and we have to be awake and aware of this.
Well, and again, Roberto Múkaro Borrero with us 7 minutes before the hour. I mentioned earlier that you all are the indigenous people. All the rest of us are immigrants, so to speak. If you want to, and I'm saying that for the sake of this conversation. Obviously, those of us who were enslaved weren't immigrants per se, but.
Right.
But as I also say, there were Africans who immigrated here and who came here to establish trade prior to Columbus. They came before Columbus folks, the books by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima.
Yes.
And you can read about that, Abubakari in the 1300s. So, but in terms of the people we call immigrants today, and I made this point in the last time I had a discussion with someone from the March, Roberto, and that is that the people we refer to as immigrants today, be they from Central America, Caribbean, whatever, themselves are indigenous people. And unfortunately, a lot of them don't know it.
Yeah.
We got to get to that point where people understand that.
Oh, yeah, and especially, this is all the results of colonization, right? The brainwashing and the moving us away from our true identities and our original instructions, and turning us as we're our peoples, or we have communities that speak their own languages, which is not English or Spanish when they're in their home countries.
Right.
They get here to the U.S. and all of a sudden they're called Latinos, right? And that's a whole other thing. And I think just very recently, we had this case of an indigenous woman from Guatemala, just lost a 7-year-old child, dehydration, that these children are not being taken care of. they're being put into facilities where the administration even removed having people's backgrounds being checked before they work with these kids. And I mean, how horrific is that, where they're put in these detention facilities? We don't know who these people are who are keeping an eye on them. No one can get in to see these kids, and it's a real horror. And you know what they say: if it happens to one community, eventually it can happen to any community.
Yeah.
This is why we need to rise up together. Understand that many of those peoples coming up from Central and South America, from Mexico, they are indigenous peoples, and we need to be in solidarity about that across communities, not only just indigenous to indigenous, but all peoples of color and other allies, right?
Right.
I mean, because this is really about human rights, and if it's going to affect one, eventually it'll affect us all if we don't stop it now.
Folks, Indigenous Peoples March coming up on January the 18th. We'll be there. We all be there. Hope you will too. Follow them on Twitter at Indigenous Peoples, and also Indigenous Peoples Movement is their website.com. IndigenousPeoplesMovement.com. Our guest has been from the U.S. Human Rights Network, Roberto Múkaro Borrero. My brother, good to talk to you. Good to meet you. Looking forward to seeing you on the 18th, okay?
I look forward to seeing you too. You take care.
All right, you too, man. 1 month from today, y'all. 1 month from today. Folks, we'll be back. Sirius XM Progress 127, Resistance Radio. Get woke. Get ready for impeachment. This is MIP.